So far so good, that seemed to work fine. So, see if we can put the outer case on. Now I notice there's some contaminants, some muck on it here. I'm not sure what that is. It's not rust. I think that's okay. The case obviously lines up with the flash contact there. We can fit the detent, the aperture settings in place. It only goes in one way correctly. The spacings at the large apertures are further apart than the spacings at the small apertures. It feels right. Now these two little screws here catch notches in the case. They're only slight indentations. You don't need to go mad doing those screws up. In fact, it's counterproductive if you do. It just keeps the case correctly aligned so that your aperture, your pointers here for the focus scale and depth of field are correctly aligned. That's good. At the front of the shutter we have this plate, just a trim ring really, and take the lens, screw that into place. Just needs to be finger tight, you don't need a spanner. At the rear of the shutter we have our rear component. Just do that up finger tight. It's still got its marks. I'm sure it'll still work fine regardless. We had one shim here and then the retainer ring. I want to see if I can find a locator screw to go in here to stop this thing from being able to rotate in the mount, because I believe that originally it probably had one. So our shutter effectively is dealt with anyway, and I can pop that to one side. I've got to assemble the bodywork next, which means of course I've got to get stuff back from the ultrasonic cleaner, which I haven't done yet. Well, I can continue putting this camera back together. Now I've got my Bellows struts here sitting in the body. Got 4 screws to hold this in place, and I'll put them somewhere useful where I'll probably never lay my hands on them again. No, there they are. Okay, 3 black screws, all in good condition. 1 nickel plated screw, 2 washers, spacers. The black screws, 2 of them go in at the film cassette well. Get that one positioned correctly. Oopsie. Alright, just want to get that started. pull those struts up. That's correct. Now, top and bottom in here is a spacer washer. That goes between the struts mechanism and the chassis at each side. The one at the top is awkward to get into position because you have the guide for the rangefinder arm sitting in there too. Yeah, just pull that into place and get it screw in there. Just do that up very lightly. One goes at the bottom of the camera in the same position. I can just see it there. I'll pull that into place and put the screw in. Should have all 4 screws in place holding those struts in place. This one is obviously not quite started correctly. That's better. That's better. Right, they're all in place. I can tighten them now. Alright, so the struts are correctly held back in the body, checking that they're nice and firm, there's no undue play, that feels good. And the focus mount can go in here now, so I'll just slide that in underneath. I'll close up the struts to hold it in place, and I see I need to change my battery. I'll stop right here and find the screws. Have 4 short nickel plated screws that hold the focus mount to the front standard. Hang on, something's not sitting correctly. That's better. One of the arms, it stops you being able to press the buttons, and if the focus hadn't been returned to infinity, was sitting out of position. That was stopping that from moving correctly. Oopsie. That screw is enthusiastic to get away. Alright. Them all in. Don't over tighten these screws, they get distorted if they're over tightened. The heads fold in towards the centre. The screw slot shrinks. That's fine. Now I need to put the 4 screws in that hold the bellows to the front standard. They go through the 4 positions at the corners. Here, the small black screws. Get all 4 started and then go around and tighten them. That's good. Just pull the front standard out into position. I need to think about my assembling the focus in the focus helical now. I'm checking the state of this, make sure it's clean enough, that there's no deposits of dried dust and stuff on here, and there is some deposits there. Yeah, I'll just run around that with a bit of solvent. There's a bit of deposit was left there from the dried out grease. That's okay. Let's get this thing together. Now I've made alignment marks so we can get this thing in the correct position. That thread of course is very dry. I'll just put a bit of solvent on there just as a temporary lube. And as luck would have it, it's about a 16 start thread or something. Anyway, it's gone in exactly the right position. Now that's lucky. I better get a lotto ticket. I'll pop this in here. I want to see what the action's like, see how smooth it is. That feels good. Alright, so just pull that back out, and I need to find my helical, my grease for doing the helicals, lubricate that, and then screw this down into place. Alright, so I'll just back that thread out most of the way and apply a little bit of grease in 5 or 6 spots around the outside. You don't need to pack the threads with grease. In fact, that's counterproductive. I'll work that in. It feels pretty good. It's a bit dry at the front. I'll just put a little spot on the front. That's nice and smooth. And some grease at the rear where it fits into the mount.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, so that's in. Check the action. Nice and smooth. Got the retainer plate. Need to run a tiny smear of grease on the back of the retainer plate where it runs up against that outer helical. It doesn't take much. Drop that into position. There's 6 screws that hold this plate in place. So run the screws in. Make sure this is set up away from the infinity position. Otherwise, you may tighten it down and effectively lock everything in if it's too far back in. run all 6 screws in. When they're all in place, then you can tighten them up. Just checking if that's the right screw. No, it wasn't. That screw was slightly smaller, that holds the rangefinder coupling arm in place. Here we go. Let's check the movement. That's nice and smooth. Focus scale ring can go in place. We have our alignment marks to make sure we get it in the correct position. And we have the tiny indentations that the screw heads had made in the focus scale ring to also act as a confirmation that we've got the alignment marks in the correct place. Now the focus wasn't tight when we started, it was quite loose, but it wasn't smooth, it was obviously dry. These screws don't need to be done up tight, they should just be nipped up. If you over tighten those screws, what happens is that you will distort the outer helical and nothing will work smoothly. So we can put our coupling arm in place. Check the position at the top, that's correct. There are 2 small screws. One of these I was busy trying to fit before by mistake. One screw at the top of the arm. This boss is what couples with the rangefinder. It pulls the arm on the rangefinder forwards or back, or allows it to move backwards depending on the setting. Just check that screw's tight. That moves correctly. I'm looking at the position of this screw. The lever looks right at the front. Ideally this screw should run pretty much straight up and down in that track, shouldn't go too far around the corner, otherwise you have trouble getting your close focus positions and your infinity positions both working correctly in the rangefinder. That looks okay, we'll leave it there for the moment. Some lubrication can go on here with the struts now. I've lubricated the slots at the back of the struts. I'll do the same now for the ones at the front of the struts. I never do these earlier because with all the handling it'll only just come off on my fingers. We've got the front door here. Put a little smear of grease on the door pins, top and bottom, where they run in those slots. That helps retain the paper washers. They're just cartridge paper. They just give you a little bit of controlled friction. So hook it into the slot at the top, stretch it out, hook it into the slot at the bottom. Now the hinge pins can go in place. Now we had a washer at the top. Oops. Just line up my hinge pin screw hole, get that washer in position, pull it in with my tweezers. Put in the hinge pin screw. Get that screw started. Doesn't want to start. That's better. Run that in and tighten it. There's no play there, so that's good. Line up the bottom screw hole. Tighten that one. Check that the door opens and shuts. It does. So that's all good. Now that's one broken screw there from because we had one broken screw on the tripod socket. I'll replace that. Okay, so far so good. That's the front of the camera done. I think the sprocket shaft next. I'm looking at the state of this. The gear is actually trapped in the top here. Between a couple of washers. I think it's actually loose on the shaft. Apart from that, I think the friction is what drives that. I think it's not exactly loose. I'll put a little bit of grease on the shaft, top and bottom. I'll run some on the gear for good measure. So this goes in here. We had a spacer washer. We have our sprocket, film sprocket. Get this into position. The roller at the bottom. And I see that the screw has come out of that sprocket. I see if there's a mark on the shaft. There's no indentation with these, which is quite interesting. Earlier ones had a hole in the shaft so that these screws would bite into it and could go nowhere else. These ones use a larger screw and they're screwed up tight against the shaft. Okay. Do that one up tight and get the other one in place. Make sure that's done up tight. That's our sprocket in place. take-up spool goes in next, so I'll put a little bit of grease on this spring, some around the centre boss that this runs on, and push this into place. The take-up shaft needs a little bit of lubricant on it. Just put a smear of synthetic grease on that shaft and be reasonably generous with that. Goes into the bush, and the bush fits into the camera in only one position. Make sure the shaft's lined up with the slot in the cassette. There are 3 screws. I'll get them started, then I'll go back and double check to make sure that the shaft is coupled to the slot in the take-up spool correctly. That all looks good. I'll tighten the 3 screws up. Check that that's right. That feels good. It's a nice controlled friction there. And it's time to change the battery.